It was supposed to be a peaceful evening. Megan's parents were out for a dinner party, and she had the house to herself. She loved being home alone, it gave her time to relax and watch movies. But that night, something felt off. She couldn't have imagined that a harmless evening would turn into a nightmarish encounter. Megan settled on the couch with a bowl of popcorn, flipping through channels to find something to watch. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, and the wind outside howled against the windows. She shrugged it off, telling herself it was just her imagination. About an hour into her movie, Megan thought she saw something move outside the living room window. At first, she ignored it, thinking it might have been a branch swaying in the wind. But as the movie progressed, she caught the movement again. This time, it wasn't the wind. It was a shadow, a dark figure standing just outside the window. Her heart raced, but she tried to stay calm, telling herself it was probably just someone passing by. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered, and she found it impossible to focus on the movie. She got up, cautiously peeking through the curtains, expecting to see nothing. But there it was, a figure standing motionless, staring directly at her. Megan's breath caught in her throat. She quickly backed away from the window, her hands trembling. She grabbed her phone, dialing her parents, but the call didn't go through. Panic started to creep in. She locked all the doors and windows, her mind racing with fear. As she moved to the back of the house, she heard a knock on the front door. It was slow and deliberate. Megan froze, her heart pounding in her ears. Whoever was out there, they weren't going away. She stayed quiet, hoping they would leave, but the knocking continued, louder this time. Megan backed into the hallway, trying to stay out of sight. Suddenly, the knocking stopped, replaced by the sound of footsteps outside the window again. She gathered her courage and looked through the curtains once more. But now, the figure was gone. The relief was short-lived, though, as she heard the sound of the back door creaking open. Someone was inside the house. Megan ran to her bedroom, locking the door behind her. She could hear footsteps moving through the house, getting closer to her room. Terrified, she hid in her closet, her breath shallow, trying not to make a sound. The footsteps stopped just outside her door. For what felt like hours, she stayed there, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But after a few minutes, the house went silent again. When her parents came home later that night, they found her still hiding in the closet, too scared to come out. They called the police, but no one was ever found. To this day, Megan still wonders who, or what, was outside her window that night. Nick had always considered himself a brave guy. Being home alone never bothered him, and he often enjoyed the solitude. But one night, a seemingly innocent phone call changed everything. Sometimes, danger doesn't knock on your door, it calls you instead. Nick's parents had gone out for the evening, leaving him with the usual instructions: lock the doors, don't answer the door for anyone, and call if there was an emergency. The night started off uneventfully, and Nick spent most of it playing video games. It was around 10 p.m. when the phone rang. He figured it was his parents checking in, so he picked it up without hesitation. "Hello?" he said, expecting to hear his mom's voice on the other end. But there was no answer. Just silence. Nick waited for a few seconds, thinking maybe it was a bad connection, but still, no one spoke. He hung up, thinking nothing of it. But a few minutes later, the phone rang again. This time, Nick felt a slight chill as he answered. Again, silence. But just as he was about to hang up, he heard breathing, slow and deliberate, as if someone was listening closely. A wave of unease washed over him. "Who is this?" Nick demanded, but there was no response. He slammed the phone down, his heart racing. He tried to shake it off, telling himself it was probably just a prank. But then, the phone rang a third time. Nick stared at it, his hand trembling as he picked up the receiver. Before he could speak, a voice on the other end whispered, "I'm inside the house." Nick's blood ran cold. He dropped the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. He frantically checked all the doors and windows, making sure they were locked, but the voice had shaken him to his core. He grabbed a kitchen knife, his eyes scanning the empty house. The silence felt oppressive, and every shadow seemed to move. Then, he heard a creak from upstairs. Nick froze, his grip tightening on the knife. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, as if someone was trying not to be heard. Panic surged through him. He quietly made his way to the front door, trying to escape, but just as he reached for the doorknob, the footsteps stopped. The house fell silent once more. Nick stayed by the door, his breathing heavy, waiting for something, anything, to happen. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of footsteps resumed, but this time, they were moving away. Nick bolted out of the house, not stopping until he was down the street, safe at a neighbor's house. The police arrived shortly after, but when they searched the house, no one was there. Nick never received another strange phone call, but he never stayed home alone again. Being home alone can make even the most mundane things feel eerie. For Emily, her fear of the basement was something she had never quite shaken. But she never thought that one night, her fear would turn into a horrifying reality. Sometimes, what we fear the most is exactly what we should be afraid of. Emily had always hated the basement in her house. It was old, creaky, and the light never worked properly. Whenever she had to go down there, she always rushed, never lingering longer than necessary. One evening, Emily's parents went out, leaving her home alone. She spent most of the night in the living room, reading and trying to ignore the unsettling quiet of the house. Everything was fine until she heard a noise. It was faint, like a door creaking open, but she couldn't quite place where it was coming from. At first, she brushed it off, thinking it might be the wind. But then she heard it again, this time, it was louder. Her heart started to race as she realized the noise was coming from the basement. Emily's mind immediately went to the basement door. She had made sure it was closed earlier, but now, she wasn't so sure. Summoning all her courage, she walked to the hallway where the basement door was. Her worst fear was confirmed, the door was slightly ajar. Emily's blood ran cold. She knew for a fact that she had closed it. She quickly shut the door and locked it, her hands shaking. She tried to convince herself that it had just been the wind, but deep down, she knew something wasn't right. As she walked back to the living room, she heard it again, the creak of the basement door opening. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. This time, she knew someone, or something, was down there. She grabbed her phone and called her parents, but they didn't answer. Fear gripped her as she stared at the basement door, which was now wide open. She didn't know what to do. Just then, she heard slow, heavy footsteps coming up the basement stairs. Emily's heart raced as she backed away, trying to stay calm, but the footsteps grew louder. She could see a shadow moving at the bottom of the stairs. In a panic, she ran to the front door, but just as she reached it, the footsteps stopped. The house was silent again, but the basement door remained open. Emily didn't wait to see who, or what, was down there. She bolted out of the house and ran to a neighbor's, her heart pounding in her ears. When her parents returned, they found the basement door open, but nothing was missing, and no one was inside. Emily never told them what happened, but she made sure to never be home alone again. To this day, she still wonders who, or what, was in the basement that night. These stories remind us that when we are alone, we are often more vulnerable than we realize. The things we fear, whether a shadow in the window, a strange phone call, or a creaky basement, can be real in ways we might not expect. The moral is to always trust your instincts, take precautions, and never ignore the warning signs, because sometimes, fear is a signal of something very real lurking in the dark.